Hi, I'm Mark Breidenbaugh, and I'm an entomologist. How do you become an entomologist? How did I become an entomologist? So I started my academic pedigree, because that's what scientists always want to talk about, is how they got to where they were. And I was interested in just general science, and I was in San Diego, California. Ended up doing 2 years of junior college, and then moving on to the 4-year institution called Cal Poly Pomona, where I studied botany. And then I thought what I wanted to do is save the world by increasing the crop production. But as it turned out, when I went to my master's degree in University of California, Riverside, I was really influenced by one of the veterinary medical entomologists, Brad Mullins, and I switched over and started dealing with insects of medical importance. So then after that, I started with I worked for just a little bit with the mosquito control district in West Los Angeles. That was a very interesting position, and then that led me into to changing over into a military career. And then while I had started with the Air Force Reserves, I had completed a PhD at Kent State working with aquatic ecology, again with interest in medical insects, specifically the biting midges, which and one particular group of the biting midges, which are the culicoides, a small insect that goes by a myriad of different names in different places, but I typically would just refer to them as biting midges or no-see-ums.
Let's take some of these questions then.
Okay, good. Let's take some questions.
How many different species of biting fly are there?
Okay, so the question is, how many different species of biting flies are there? Well, I don't know the answer to that question specifically. It's a complicated one because for one reason, scientists are constantly finding new species of insects, and that includes the biting flies. There's a lot of them, though, is the really quick question. And if we break it down just a little bit, we'll probably tell you a couple things that maybe you don't know about what biting flies are. So flies are a group of insects that have only one pair of wings. And most insects have 2 pairs of wings. In the flies, the second pair of wings have been reduced into a stabilizing device, usually referred to as halteres. So what types of flies are there? Well, there's house flies. But what about biting flies? Well, we have a group of flies called the horn flies and the stable flies. And the common stable fly is Stomoxys calcitrans. Is very, it's an economic pest. It'll bite dogs, it'll bite cattle, it'll bite people, and it looks a lot like a housefly. So that's what people perhaps maybe would think. And then additionally, you have things called deer flies and horse flies, some big, robust flies. They also suck on blood, and so there's another family of flies. And there's, I think, with just the house flies, just the tabanids, which are the deer flies and the horse flies, there's at least 4,300 species in the world, and the list goes on. So some flies that bite, people might not even recognize as flies. So this is where I'm going to introduce the mosquito, for example. The mosquito is actually a fly. It has 1 pair of wings, and is considered a dipteran. Other families that are very similar to that, like the Ceratopagonidae, which is the biting midges that I just talked about, is another group of flies, and it kind of goes on and on from there. Although there's not that many flies, we could, if we had a book to sort of guide us through, we could go through all the different important species of biting flies and actually come up with a number, I suppose. But I can't do it here off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. Now you said a number of these flies they'll bite cats, dogs, humans. Do they pose hazards? Do they carry disease?
Right, so it kind of comes with the territory. If you are going to feed on blood, that's called hematophagy. Hematophagus insects have the potential to cause disease, because if one organism has a disease and they bite them and then ingest the blood, and that if it's a blood-borne pathogen, then they could mechanically spread that pathogen. But in addition, Many of these species have developed very interesting relationships with the pathogens that they vector. Vector being a word, I'm using that word in the sense of moving the pathogen from one organism to another. So, for example, one thing that we're probably all aware of is mosquitoes are the vector of malaria parasites, and the malaria protozoan. So it's picked up a mosquito, say, for human malaria, would bite a human with a protozoite, a malaria protozoite in their blood. It would ingest it, and then that protozoite actually goes through part of its biology, its life cycle inside the mosquito, and it increases in number and then can be spread to other humans, and that's the process of how these organisms spread disease, and that's a little bit different than the mechanical mechanism, where maybe through the process of picking up blood or for example bacteria, when one insect is developing or feeding on manure or excrement of some kind. Unfortunately, it's kind of disgusting, but it's what flies actually, houseflies and other related flies feed on, and then they will fly over and they can move those pathogens to your food source. That's how you could spread salmonella around or something like that. So we have to, the world needs entomologists to sort of keep track of all this stuff and find out and develop ways to improve public health. It's one of the major things that we do.
So you do work with medical professionals to develop treatments for the diseases, or?
So entomologists work on mostly how to control the actual organism of the insect portion. So we would form partnerships with medical personnel to work on lateral aspects of that, but specifically what we want to know how to do is, for example, exclude these types of harmful insects from getting to areas where they can cause disease, or develop materials and methods such as pesticides or fans or vacuums or some type of device, other type of mechanical device to actually remove insects from the environment before they can cause the disease.
Okay, cool. Okay, let's see a question from the web. This question comes from P Money. He asks, I heard only female mosquitoes suck blood. If so, what do males eat?
Okay, Mr. Money, you are correct. In most of the biting flies, it's the females that need to take a blood meal to, and why would they need to do that? Well, the females have to produce an egg, a clutch, if you will, a batch of eggs, and the nitrogen that's present in some of the other nutrients that are present in blood are necessary for them to develop these eggs. So yeah, it is the females. So what do the males eat? Well, you'd have to follow one around to find out, is what we have to do. So there's a lot of different hypotheses, but in general, I mean not hypotheses, but there's some evidence, direct evidence. You could also catch males, and you could dissect their stomachs and see what is what's actually in there through some sort of an analysis. But we know that males, you have to find some sort of nutritional stuff out in the environment. So what they're doing is they're sucking nectar from flowers, typically, or perhaps they're eating a little bit. In some cases, they're eating some pollen. And there are even cases where some males, their lives are so short that they don't even eat at all. They don't feed at all. They just sort of emerge from their immature stage, and they fly around and look for a female to mate with, and then once they've done that, then they just sort of expire.
You bring up an interesting question. How long is there an average lifespan for each different species, or is there a general estimate for biting flies in general? How long do these...
Right, well, because biting flies it's not a very succinct term, because we have some flies with very different evolutionary derivations that are sucking blood. So we have the house flies like stable fly on one hand, which has a big, and the tabanids, which are these big fat piercing mouth parts. And we have the ones that are sucking blood with, very advanced mechanisms like the mosquito. But here's the thing: if you want to talk about mosquitoes, there's a lot of work done on them because, they're a very important insect. So in general, mosquitoes probably live about 3 to 4 weeks. In the laboratory, we could probably keep them alive for 4 weeks because they don't have to suffer from environmental conditions like excessive heat or excessive cold or get eaten. They just have to worry about getting squished when you set down a little feeding dish for them or something like that. So yeah, they all have different lifespans. And one of the fun things that you can do if you're an entomologist is keep track of how long individual insects live, and you can create a thing called life tables, which a lot of entomologists have done a great business creating life tables for all sorts of insects. So it's really, what you're asking is really important, and it turns out that they live and develop slower or faster depending on what temperature you raise them at, because insects are cold-blooded in the sense that they, the way that we talk about an organism that doesn't maintain a exact body temperature through its own physiological processes. It does things like, it tries to regulate its body temperature by moving to areas to receive sunlight, or flexing its own muscles to create heat within its body and things like that.
You talked about dissecting the stomachs of male mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
How do you dissect such a small creature?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you saw the Seinfeld when they asked him how he was going to work on the squirrel. We have very small instruments.
Okay.
Yeah, and sadly it is fatal, of course, to the insect. But yeah, it's typically you would use this is actually a stereo microscope, or what we would call a dissection microscope, to aid your abilities as you get up in the years like I am now. I used to be able to do a lot of the stuff, with just a hand lens, or even with just looking at these things, and you could tease them apart with some forceps. But yeah, we usually will make our own tools, sort of like building your own lightsaber. You have to use these things. There are some commercially available products, but when you're first starting out, you might be a poor graduate student and not be able to afford them. So that's something that you just have to do. A steady hand, not too much coffee. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a favorite? Well, first let's begin with this. Can you differentiate for us the difference between bugs, insects, beetles, arthropods in general?
Sure. So these are really technical questions in many aspects. But if you take a general biology class in college, or even in high school, you'll come out with an understanding of taxonomy, right? Taxonomy is really the science of categorizing and giving names to organisms, especially and specifically, it is based on their evolutionary derivations, where they came from and who they're related to. So these giant family trees. So insects are a class of animals. And it would be a class of the insects would be similar to the class of mammals. They're quite different. And then under all of those insects, we broadly break them up into these things called orders. And so one of the orders are the bugs, and that is just a specific type of insect. So they typically have piercing mouth parts and crawl around and have they have a bunch of different types of morphologies, but commonly spoken, people call anything a bug, and that's fine. That's just the way people talk. But entomologists can't speak like that. So we can't call a ladybird beetle a ladybug because it's not a bug. It's a beetle. So why is it a beetle? Well, it has a series of characteristics. And for the beetles, it's these shield. The name of the beetle is Coleoptera, and that means shield wings. So they have usually a very stout, and remember most insects have two pairs of wings, so they have a stout pair of outer wings and then a membranous pair of inner wings in general, because there's so many beetles, and beetles are the most numerous of the insects in general. So I think someone once said if you randomly choose an animal from the world, you have a 1 in 6 chance of picking up a beetle. So they're very, very common. I think, I'm not sure who it was, it might have been Darwin that said that, that God had an interesting predilection for beetles or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot of them, and I think there's a lot of diversity in the group. So that was so that's how we kind of we talk about those as beetles versus bugs and flies. I had already mentioned that the defining characteristic of the fly was that we call them diptera, ptera, 2 wings. So that's their defining characteristic. So if you know a little bit of Latin and Greek, then you can kind of find out what all of these names mean. In many cases, they're named actually from those Latin and Greek derivations. Hope that answers that question.
Do you have a favorite? Is there a general word for all these creatures?
Yeah, you creepy crawlies. Yeah.
Okay, well, do you then have a favorite creepy crawly?
So yeah, well, if you use creepy crawly, I suppose it really broadens the playing field. And I didn't go into, on the previous question, really into the whole spiders question as well. But, spiders are, have almost everyone knows spiders have 8 legs, and that they're arachnids, and so that helps, because you can kind of say, well, but there's not too many people that specifically are arachnologists, so entomologists sort of cover that area. But yeah, no, I would say, if you were just speaking to common people, what's your favorite bug, or what is your favorite insect? I think that's okay. What's your favorite insect? Right? I mean, everyone understands insect. So, what are my favorite insects? Well, I like dragonflies a lot. I think they're pretty amazing. They have a long evolutionary history. In fact, perhaps one of the largest insects to ever live. We know only from the fossil record, and it had, I think, a wingspan of about 3 feet, about a meter. So you can imagine what that thing was eating and flying around. They're predators, and they have these interesting mouth parts where you wonder when Hollywood gets all their best stuff, like from aliens and things, with these mouth parts that are opening. And if you look at insects under the microscope, you'll find out where Hollywood's getting their stuff, because nature's created some pretty nasty looking chompers out there over time. But so yeah, I like those. And then of course, my area of interest are the culicoides, these biting midges, and because they've provided a great career and I guess a living, a way of life for me. I appreciate that. So I would say they're also sort of my favorite insect. But my friend Dr. Brian Cabrera, he actually, when he came back from Puerto Rico, where he probably came in touch with Culicoides furans, he came back and said that the biting midge was his new least favorite insect. So it might be my favorite, it's his least favorite. It's understandable, right?
Mm-hmm. So how do you, in your job, strike a balance between controlling and preserving the species?
Right. That's a really good question. I mean, that's actually I would say that's the tenet and the foundation for how we operate. We operate under this umbrella called integrated pest management, and it's so important. It's been around probably from the beginnings of it were the 60s, but it was really developed strongly in the 70s and implemented then. But integrated pest management is even the acronym IPM is used as a word in our field. I mean, it's pretty much accepted as just as a term, and I think it has relevance outside of just our field. I mean, have you heard of IPM measures before? Mm-hmm. Okay, so integrated pest management, and what that allows us to do is, instead of if you found out that you could spray arsenic on particular plant and all the insects fell off of it, and it turns out that you had a larger crop, you might understand from human nature that you would probably do that again and again and again and again, and you come to rely on that pretty heavily. And you might forget that before you started spraying that arsenic on there, that if you did some other types of things like only water at a certain time of the day, or if you had a way of encouraging those same insects to leave that plant because maybe you planted another more desirable plant on the periphery, or those types of things that might get lost. So integrated pest management, what it tries to do is it doesn't eliminate the use of pesticides or any type of chemical measures, but what it does is it asks you to look at the life cycle and the life habits of the organism that you're wanting to control, manage. To manage probably is a better word. And you then set up a strategy using all of your knowledge about the way that this organism goes about its business, and you try to develop a strategy that has the least effect on the environment, the least negative effect on the environment. And so for mosquitoes, for example, I'll say some of our integrated pest management practices. One of them is that mosquitoes develop as larvae that wiggle around in water. So if we can apply a material at that stage to try to kill them, it's preferred in some ways because we know exactly where they are. They're contained in this water source. They're not on the wing, flying around in who knows where. Okay, so that's one good reason to concentrate on that area. And the other thing is that we've developed some pesticides that are what we call biorational. In other words, they mimic hormones that are specifically found in that organism and don't have a broad spectrum of effect on other organisms and things like that. There's another really cool material that is that causes a surface film over the water. That's based on an alcohol molecule, so eventually it will break down, because in the old days people put oil on water, and that would suffocate mosquitoes because they have to breathe by sticking a siphon, a breathing tube, up through the water surface. But you can put just enough of a layer over there, and they can't get out. Now some other organisms breathe that way too, and so it could cause them some non-target effects. But you're always going to have some non-target effects. But that's an example of one way that we think about integrated pest management. Also, mosquitoes fly at different times of the day, so if you're going to spray for them, you would maybe time your spray application. This is the dogma which we operate in, is that when those mosquitoes are flying, if you put pesticide out into the air, it's very small droplets in small quantities that will fly through those clouds and contact those pesticides and die. So if you're doing that, like a lot of mosquitoes fly right after dark. If you could do it then, you wouldn't have butterflies or dragonflies or honeybees being exposed to those pesticides, and that's the way we think about it. Even better is if you're in an area where you don't have to do an activity at that same period when the mosquitoes are actually flying, then you could just eliminate the human exposure to that. But humans, for their quality of life, like to move around when they want to and how they want to. So as long as entomologists are asked to protect people's health while they're capable of doing those things, we'll try to respond to that, because sometimes it's not just humans wanting to take a walk after dark. A lot of times it could be that an airplane just landed at the international airport and you have to put fuel on it. And I mean, that's just the reality of it. So we humans are active at all times of the day. But those would be hopefully reasonable examples of integrated pest management.
Take another question from the web, and you addressed this to some extent, talking about how you got into this. Hey Baylor asks, how does a person become an entomologist? Can you recommend specific schools or programs?
I had a guy I went to high school with, and of course this is like almost 30 years ago. He just wrote me the other day and asked me, wrote me on Facebook and said that his daughter was about to graduate from high school, and she was interested in becoming an entomologist. Did did I care if she contacted me? Of course not. Entomologists are usually proud of their profession. It's a fun one. It's great work. Usually you're going to be outdoors some. You get to work with a bunch of other crazy scientist types, and you're working with some of the most interesting of God's creatures. It's a great career field, and I highly recommend it as long as you don't mind a lot of reading, looking at small things, because we tend to think of, like, when you might think of your first and favorite insects, you might think of like a Luna moth that's this big, or a giant, one of your favorite butterflies. I guess I was thinking of the monarchs. Yeah, I was thinking of the monarchs. It's a relatively large insect, and big beetles. Well, it turns out that the majority of insects are really small, so you're going to be squinting a lot, I suppose, and potentially working with a bunch of diverse things. But anyhow, so how do you get into entomology? You get a strong background in the sciences, and you also develop a bit of scientific writing, I think, would be good. And then understand that, because this is what scientists do in any of the scientific field, is that we conduct research. We go into the labs, whether they're outdoor laboratories, but we conduct experiments, we process data, and then we share that data through publications. And so it's a pretty intense process. It can be enjoyable. It can also be very demanding. So it's not all Hollywood and mirrors, like it looks like. But no, in all seriousness, so you want a strong science foundation. You got to know some math. When you go through college, you can expect to do a full series of chemistry, at least a full year of chemistry, and then some organic chemistry and some biochemistry. Probably looking at a year of physics, but maybe some of the programs allow you to do a non-calculus-based physics. You'll have to have calculus, but you'll probably in some cases you'll have options to do calculus for the life sciences, which is sort of a watered-down version from the ones that the engineers have to do. But you're going to definitely be doing some science, and then after that you'll jump into for most biologists the more interesting courses, which involved ecology, how animal communities and environmental communities are put together, and food webs and those types of topics that are a lot of fun. And then just the memorization of all of these pathways and the different organisms. So then you would go to college, but most entomology jobs are going to require you to have an advanced degree. And I think it's widely recognized that the master's degree is the best bang for your buck. I mean, you can get one of those after your bachelor's degree. You could some people can knock them out in 2 years, although I think most people do 3 years if you have a field project. But the beauty of this is a lot of times you can get a stipend to teach while you're doing it. And if you get one of those, you typically have a reduction in fees. Other stipends will allow you to maybe work in a museum on the campus, and or let's see, besides working, besides teaching the classes, you might just work for one of the well-funded professors or the well-funded labs. So, what universities do I recommend? Obviously, I would be partial to the University of California's. They have a couple great programs, but there are some awesome programs all over the country, and I won't get into mentioning any names. But here's the thing: the land grant institutions, those ones that were provided through the Hatch Act to provide support to the agricultural communities, typically all have some really strong programs. And I think you can do a top 10 search on Google pretty easily, or in some cases they might be included in the U.S. News and World Report programs. I think there's you can find even entomology in there. So that's actually how I went about doing it, because I didn't know any entomologists when I went down the field.
Where do you stand on the big bee mystery everyone's talking about today?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So I keep bees here in Ohio. Okay, I have a couple hives, and I've never had what you're referring to as this thing that has been, the name that's been put to it is called colony collapse disorder, CCD, and it is something that we've recognized in the last, I guess, 10 years, starting about 2000, so it's almost 15 now, because it might have been a little bit before that, but just a large number of bee colonies were dying for no reason. But prior to that, some invasive species such as tracheal mites, some mites that live in the bees' breathing apparatus, their trachea, were introduced into the country, and so the bees were having already under a tremendous amount of stress. And of course, bees also fly into agricultural fields, because there's a lot of flowers there, and those agricultural fields will be treated with pesticides. So they pick those up. They consume, I'm not really sure if their physiology sort of makes them more exposed to pesticides, because I tried to answer that question for myself. I had a hard time really clearly delineating that, whether or not the Hymenoptera in general or honeybees specifically were more susceptible to pesticides. But I think one of the problems is that their behavior certainly exposes them to pesticides. So if pesticides are moving through an area, as I discussed about mosquitoes, if you're a flying insect and you're flying through that, you're going to pick up more and more drops. And bees are constantly moving from flower to flower, so they're exposing themselves to more and more pesticide than, for example, a spider that's like an ambush predator that's waiting, or a beetle that's just chewing on one leaf or something. So I think that's really what happens. But so there's a lot of different groups that have been looking into what the cause of colony collapse disorder is, and they've decided that it's actually a cadre of problems, and pesticides is one of them. The pathogens of the mosquitoes and parasites of the bees. The parasites and pathogens of the bees are also lending themselves to that. So where I grew up in Southern California, I'm from San Diego. When I was a kid, we had honeybees all over the place, and I remember that specifically because we had a lot of ice plant out front, and they would be all over that. I noticed it, by the mid-90s that they were no longer there, and that's pretty tragic. So what really happened is that these wild colonies that were living in trees and tree spaces and stuff, they just really died, and the only ones that were left were the ones that people were managing. But what's interesting is that, and I can't really, because I'm not living there anymore, but here in Southern California, in Northeast Ohio, my garden is visited by a lot of wild bees still. A lot of bumblebees. That's a bigger little bee that lives by itself. If it doesn't live in a colony. She goes out and she digs a hole in the ground, and she feeds her larvae from the pollen and nectar that she gets each day. These are solitary bees, as we call them. So. And some people are trying to use bumblebees for pollination of their crops, and that's interesting too. But just real quick, like, in my area, I never have used any pesticides to try to protect the bees from the mites, and I have seen some mites in my colonies. I've also not ever had a colony collapse. I've had some problems getting them through the coldest winters, and that's probably my fault for just not being able to quite manage them correctly. But where I have them located, there's a lot of wind, and I think sometimes they just get a little too cold, or especially because they don't hibernate, they stay in a ball, and they kind of do that, like if you're familiar with the way the penguins stay warm, they go to the outside and then come back into the center. Bees basically do the same thing. Like the bees sort of vibrate their wings, and all that creates heat, and then when you get a ball of them, if you're in the center, you're toasty. Because bees have to keep they're a tropical insect. They have to try to stay warm. And that's how they do it. So I'm not personally, I'm not an expert in bees, but I think that we're going to be okay with this, with a colony collapse disorder, because there's enough breeders that are trying to work through all of these. And making people aware of it's great. But unfortunately, I also have noticed that it just seems like a fairly sensationalized story for reporters to pick up on and to talk about. So they're like, well, some crops, I think, will indeed suffer some yield losses. For example, almonds are well known to be a very poorly to produce poor yields without any honeybees, and certainly oranges and stuff too. So, but is it going to cause a mass starvation event in the world? I don't think so. I think the wild bees will pick up and keep going, and so we might need to get more people interested in managing colonies of bees, and that's one of the reasons why I did it. Because I'm just interested, and I like honey too. So yeah, let's all start grazing bees.
Okay. Okay, so they've got 2 minutes of battery left. So do you have any final thoughts?
No, thanks so much. I hope that
Thank you.
You get what you need. I like to think of them as just little tiny robots, because they don't have a lot. The French entomologist, who was a behavioralist, Fabre, he did some amazing stuff with insect behavior. Things like tent caterpillars that were on their marching behaviors, and how he found out that they were following a string that the leader was laying down, and he could do things like take that string, instead of it leading back to their nest, he would maybe attach it and make a circle, and these guys would march in circles to their deaths, because they were programmed to do that. Now a few, and this is the part that gets interesting, a few of them would do some searching behaviors, and sometimes they would wander off and give themselves a chance to maybe find a way back home or whatever. But in general, their rules of negotiating, which is follow the thread, are so strong that they don't have a mechanism really to get outside of that. So that's why I say they're very much like little robots.